Smooth jazz.
Yeah.
That's good. It's good. Doesn't have to be so heavy.
Smooth conversation.
It's cool.
Do let us know when we've gone live, yeah? All right. Okay, our participants are entering. All right. Hi, everybody. Thank you guys so much for coming in to today's webinar on decriminalizing suicide. Make yourselves comfortable. We will start in a bit. Discussion. Maybe we could get to know who are our panelists today.
The music's a bit louder, Malaysia, if you don't mind.
Yeah? Okay, come. I will decrease. Don't worry. All right. Just a little bit. Okay. So for those of the attendees who are attending today, it would be great to get to know your name, maybe your occupation. Are you a student? Okay, sure thing. I thought it would take more time for people to come in. All right, so if everybody could introduce maybe their names, their occupation, and in the spirit of mental health, we could talk about what is the one thing that you've done this past week to take care of your mental health. So for me, my name is Marisha. I'll be a moderator for today. And in the last week, I have been exercising in order to clear my mind. So if I could just get to know everybody, it'll be great. I see I've met Jelly Lee, 𝗛𝗢𝗦𝗧𝗘𝗗, Ashraf, Ravi Varma. Let's just give a few more minutes because we need to start on Facebook Live, but I'd love to get to know you. So do put in your names, whether you're a student or any other occupations, and what have you been doing to take care of your mental health? Nice to meet you, Love. Oh, you're a fresh grad from health. That's really, really great. And definitely spending quality time with family is really important. All right, who else? Wow, we have over 100 people joining us on Zoom and some more on Facebook Live. They've just connected with us, so it's great. Oh, wow, you're a medical student, 𝗦𝗣𝗢𝗦𝗧𝗘𝗗. Wow, that's really interesting. Gaming. Man, if only my laptop could game as well. Barini, nutrition. Wow, okay. That's very interesting. That I'm glad that you're learning about psychology here. It's really great. Judy, great. Journaling, it's what I do as well. All right, so I think we can start. But please do keep introducing yourself. We would love to get to know you. Playing your guitar is great. All right, so I'll start now, but please go ahead in the chat section. To everybody on Zoom and on Facebook Live, welcome and thank you for joining us in our session on decriminalizing suicide. My name is Marisha and I will be your moderator for today. So let me just stop sharing my screen first. So when it comes to suicide, we know that it is a real issue in Malaysia, and especially with the pandemic, suicide rates have been increasing. So everybody here at the Reframe Project and the Malaysian Center of Constitutionalism and Human Rights decided that we should have a critical discussion with you and with our esteemed panelists. And before we get started, here are some ground rules. just to let you know that this session will be recorded just for our safekeeping. And if you would like to ask any questions to our esteemed panelists, feel free to put it on the Q&A session for Zoom viewers. And for Facebook Live viewers, you may put it in the comment section. All right. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our 4 esteemed panelists. First up is Mr. 𝗔𝗕𝗢𝗘𝗥𝗦. He is a seasoned member of Befrienders, and he's been helping out in both, talking to people who have gone through suicide attempts, as well as training people to help people who are dealing with mental health issues. And he's also a lecturer right now and has actually written a report on how media is reporting on suicide. So it's very nice to have 𝗔𝗕𝗢𝗘𝗥𝗦 here. Next, we have Miss ANITA. Maybe Miss ANITA, you can give a wave, say hi.
Hello, hi everyone.
So Miss ANITA is actually the president and founder of MIASA, the Mental Illness Awareness and Support Association.
Very good.
She is also, thank you so much. And she's also currently leading the national coalition to create some policy changes when it comes to suicide. So we're very happy to have her here as well. Our third speaker is a research and advocacy officer from SOULS 24/7. Can we please welcome Ms. Sulin? Ms. Sulin, would you like to say hi?
Hi, hello.
Yes.
Thanks, Marisha. I'm
No
from
problem.
SOULS Health, which is
Yes.
also part of SOULS 24/7, but just a slight clarification.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Sulin. Sulin is a very interesting person as well because she has done her master's in Cambridge on history. Am I right, Sulin?
Yes, that's
Yes.
right.
And so she has written some reports on our Malaysian mental health system, so she can really give us a thorough knowledge on that. And last but not least, we have MCCHR's own Chief Human Rights Strategist, Ms. FIRDAUS HUSNI. FIRDAUS, would you like to say hi? Sorry, FIRDAUS, we can't hear you. It's okay. While you fix your mic, I'll just help you with your introduction.
What about now? Is that
yes,
better?
now we
Okay.
can hear you. All right.
Sorry for that.
No worries. So FIRDAUS is going to be our lawyer for today. She actually is a human rights activist, part of the Malaysian Bar Council, and was also a practicing lawyer. So she has thorough knowledge when it comes to our constitution and Malaysia's legal system. So hopefully she can help us with the legal aspect of suicide. So these are our amazing panelists. And today we're going to go through what is suicide, why are we criminalizing suicide, why should we decriminalize suicide, and what can we do together to decriminalize suicide. So I'm excited to start this wonderful journey with our panelists and our attendees today, and I hope that you're looking forward to it. If you have any questions or concerns, please put it up in the chat and my technical team will help us with it. Without further ado, let's begin. Okay, so hi everybody. Thank you to all the panelists again for joining us. Now to start out simple, we need to go back to basics. Maybe I can get Justin and ANITA to tell us a little bit about what suicide is. What is the definition of it?
ANITA, after you, ANITA. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Justin.
Okay.
Your Befrienders.
Yeah. Your question is, what is suicide, is it? Yeah, so suicide is the intentional taking of one's own life, killing oneself, and it's administered or done by oneself. Has to be differentiated from assisted suicide, where somebody helps and they're doing it for medical purposes. So I think at a very basic level, just to understand that suicide is this, just other terms that people use maybe would be parasuicide, or they would say suicide attempt. So to differentiate these various things. So usually you would say also, if I may just go on, since we're talking a bit of definitions, people would say committing suicide, which is a thing we'd really like to move away from, and makes much more sense under this forum of decriminalization, because committing puts that label of doing something wrong, Yeah. So we say died by suicide. Yeah, and then the other is that people actually attempt suicide sometimes, and sometimes they die by suicide. I think that's enough for now. I guess later, anything else?
Thank you very much, Justin. I think you covered it. Suicide pretty much is when you end your life and it's completed. That is what it is.
And what is the difference between suicide and suicide attempt then?
Suicide attempts is when you have the intention of dying, but it's unsuccessful. So normally you would differentiate it with a suicide completion or a completion of suicide and a suicide attempt.
Understand. Thank you so much, Anita.
You're welcome.
So I just wanted to know, these acts have been defined, but what causes somebody to die by suicide? We won't use the word commit suicide. I understand the connotation. Die by suicide or attempt suicide. Maybe Sulin, you can give us some ideas from that.
Hi, Marisha. Hi. So your question, just to clarify, would be what are some of the reasons that might drive a person to commit suicide? Well, I think there are several risk factors that we can point to. And perhaps one way to go about it might be to look recently at a report that was published in the news. I think it was sometime last week, which sort of looked at the period of MCO, starting from March 18 up till now. And the report had actually revealed some pretty concerning statistics about suicide cases that had occurred in the community within MCO. So based on that report, there were a total of 266 attempted suicide cases that took place in the community. And of that number, there was a breakdown of causes related to that. And about a quarter of those cases of attempted suicide were related to financial difficulties. So what I mean by that is debt issues and unemployment issues as well, followed thereon by relationship problems, marriage issues. And this is not something that is new to us. You know, we are in a very novel situation with COVID-19. And of course, the kind of psychological stresses that are explicitly affecting society are becoming even more apparent. But even before, you know, the world was kind of struck by this pandemic, a lot of research has shown that there are very clear risk factors associated with the reason why a person might be driven to take his or her own life. And amongst these, as I've stated, unemployment issues, you know, relationship problems, pre-existing mental health conditions as well. Although this is not necessarily a condition, you know, an absolute condition for suicide. A person who is struggling with his or her mental health will naturally have a higher risk of going towards that act. Yeah.
Right. So wanting to die by suicide or suicide attempts don't just come from nowhere. It's actually from very concrete things that people are struggling with. Right.
Definitely. Marisha, if I may add.
Sure.
You know, really with the current numbers of suicide that, you know, 800,000, nearly 800,000 people die via suicide every single year. And what we need really to understand that suicidal thoughts, you know, ideation are really intrusive. And, you know, what is in the state of a mind of a person going through that is actually extreme anguish. You know, it's a lot of agony, emotional pain, helplessness, hopelessness. The thought process is closed. You know, my life is so painful. My mind is not working clearly. I can't think of alternatives. So the excruciating pain compounded with feeling of being trapped with no alternatives and solutions may lead someone to, however afraid one might feel about dying, would choose that over living without seeing that way out. So I think this is the thought process of this, or the state of mind of that person, where we need to understand. So that feeling of being trapped, hopelessness, is what pushes that person if nobody helps, if there's no support, if treatment doesn't come in. So this is what we need to understand and realize. So the person going through that state of mind, that thought process needs to be helped.
I understand. Justin, do you often hear those kinds of sentences and lines from people on call?
Yes, very much so. So, I mean, even in our training and all, and whenever we speak to somebody, maybe it can really be boiled down to, it's not making it simplistic, but really boiled down to a sense of hopelessness and helplessness for whatever reason. So when they come to that point, people say, I can't go on, I can't face, I can't, just bear the pain that I'm going through now. So sometimes it's pain, sometimes, and not always is it necessarily to want to kill themselves, but a lot of it is to stop the pain. They call it cessation of pain. So if somehow that can be relieved, then they don't really want to die per se. So this is, in a sense, some of the states of mind that we hear. Maybe I just also want to add, people always ask what leads people to want to end their life. And I think a lot of the research shows a large portion, and some say up to 80% or so, have some kind of medical or mental health illness issues, either diagnosed or not. So that's important, because otherwise, it becomes too simple when you say, now COVID people lost their job, and then because of that, they want to die or decide to take their life. So it never happens that just that one little trigger thing makes them want to kill themselves.
Right.
So it's just to know that it is actually a complex issue. But yes, definitely something like COVID can add in. Maybe I'm jumping ahead of.
No worries.
Just to add on, Justin, to the point that you made, it's very true indeed that it doesn't happen because of one single factor. I think it's important to realize that, in fact, there are multiple reasons that come into play before someone really is driven to that edge of considering taking his or her life. And thank you also for pointing out, that the intention or the will behind why someone would attempt suicide, it's not necessarily that he or she has a strong, firm conviction of ending his life, but most of the time it is a cry for help. And this is why we can see, and here I must apologize and rectify my figures a little bit, that the 266 number that I mentioned was actually the number of completed suicides that had taken place from March to October. Whereas if we compare this to the number of attempted suicide cases, so this is slightly different, in Malaysia between January to June, there was a total of 465 attempted suicides. So that sort of makes us think a bit that, the number of people who attempt but do not successfully complete is almost double, at least in this year, that of the number of people who actually go on to successfully complete the act. So it really does seem to suggest that most of the time, these individuals are not fully convicted that they are that they want to end it all, but it's just they cannot think of any other way to solve whatever issues or pain that they're facing.
Right. Well, thank you guys so much. From what I understand, when a person wants to attempt suicide, it's not a simple thing. It doesn't come out of nowhere. Things pile up, and then they cannot find any means to relieve it. And that's where they go for that alternative. And that's when it becomes dangerous. But I really love the fact that you guys said that just because somebody may want to attempt suicide, that does not mean he or she wants to die. And that's a very, very good thing that you guys have really pointed out. So thank you so much for that. Now we understand the definition and cause of suicide and attempt of suicide from maybe a health perspective, but maybe we could hear from FIRDAUS what she understands about suicide from a legal perspective, and maybe some examples about that.
Thank you. So when we talk about suicide from a legal perspective, that particular issue is actually provided for in our penal code, in the Malaysian penal code. I will read it out here, specifically section 309, where it says that whoever attempts to commit suicide, I take note of what Justin said earlier, and this is one problem with our provision, of course. Whoever attempts to commit suicide, that's one, and does any act towards the commission of such offense shall be punished with imprisonment for a term which may extend to 1 year or with fine or both. So this is what we have in our penal code. Yeah. One might say, why do we even have that in the first place? It's a mental health issue, right? I think we can all agree that it's a mental health issue that needs to be addressed, that needs help, that needs psychological, psychiatric attention. And so in addressing that question, what would be helpful here is to then ask why or what was the intention behind including it in the first place. Yeah. Section 309 was very similar in context, almost word for word, with the Indian Penal Code. And it was exactly Section 309 also, which provides the same punishment. And how did the Indian Penal Code have that? It was enacted and implemented during the British times when they were colonizing India. And what we can see here is that the whole concept comes from the British, yeah, and it all actually was premised on religion, specifically Christianity, which sees, or rather within the idea of Christianity, God is seen as the only one rightful to end one's life. And so ending one's own life, that act, it would be an act that would be against the idea of Christianity, that would be an act that is against God, and so therefore it is a sin. And so in Britain back then, the religious institution plays a much more significant role as they do today, and that has shaped their law. So that was how we got Section 309 in our penal code. But what is important to as we talk about decriminalizing suicide, is that in 1961 the UK had done away with criminalizing suicide, and in India they still have that Section 309, but they have what is called Mental Health Care Act, which sort of negates Section 309 by saying that if someone attempts suicide, there's a presumption, unless proven otherwise, there's a presumption that that person is under severe stress, and so therefore that person cannot be made liable or cannot be made to face punishment under their Section 309. I'll stop here. Maybe I can elaborate more after this. Thank you.
No, thank you so much, FIRDAUS. I think it's really important to note about what exactly is our Penal Code 309, what it entails, and why it was entailed. Now, you mentioned how you were wondering why, even though suicide should be managed from a health and psychological point of view, we still have the legal system. So before I go into that as to why we decriminalize suicide, I would love to hear from Sulin, Justin, and Anita about some of the treatments that we currently have to help people who have attempted suicide.
Did you say treatment?
Yes, or any like measures to help them manage. Yes.
Okay, so yeah, I'll start, and I'm sure Anita knows a lot more also about that from the ground, But basically, so if someone has actually done the action of trying to take their life, the immediate is to actually take them to some medical facility to help them, because sometimes immediate intervention is needed because it's something ingested or whatever, but if otherwise, then they could be taken to also to the hospital to be checked. And after that, it's important that they get treatment. So here's where there are some gaps in our system where Sometimes people are released right away without actually being kept or held for observation and further treatment. And this is an issue from both sides. That means the victim and their families, and also the authorities, which means that sometimes the family don't want to take it any further, don't want to put them into the system, etc. And sometimes the authorities don't see or don't feel that they are an immediate threat to themselves, and then let them go off without keeping them for further observation. You notice here that I say I've taken out everything about the legal aspect or the police coming into the picture. So police sometimes step in, and then, but usually they would, as far as I know, allow the medical process to go through, and then later decide whether it's going to be, the person's going to be charged, and the legal process goes on further. Maybe the others add some more.
Yeah,
Thank
I think
you.
I could step in and maybe give a little bit more context about, from the policy perspective, what would happen. So typically in Malaysia, the official diagnosis of suicide is based on a post-mortem examination. And that happens typically in most public hospitals, whereby if a report is made of someone who has taken his or her own life, typically the police would then bring the body to the emergency department, and thereon to the mortuary. And the police, under our law, they are empowered to actually ask or order a forensic post-mortem to be carried out. And this is a standard examination. It's slightly different if it's a clinical post-mortem. You would then need the consent of the family members to be involved as well. But for a standard post-mortem, that would usually require, the body to be examined, and if there is supporting evidence that shows that there is a predominance of evidence indicating that there was an intention to take the life, then it would be diagnosed as a suicide. Now, as for classification of the types of suicide, currently our government or our healthcare system relies on the categories that are stated in the ICD, which is the International Classification of Disease. So under that, you do have a chapter that's dedicated to external causes of mortality and morbidity. And if you look at the codes, there's quite a wide range actually. It goes from X60 to something like X84. And those are broadly divided into intentional self-poisoning, whether it's by exposure to alcohol, to drugs, to harmful substances. And the other element is that of intentional self-harm, which you then go into the subcategories of the various methods. So I suppose that gives you a bit of the operational definition of suicide. As for the policy, from the more of a policy angle, I think currently our status quo, as FIRDAUS has mentioned, is quite mixed. The message from the top is quite mixed in the sense that if you take it from a medical perspective, suicide is, and it is recognized as an underlying issue that requires treatment and medical supervision and support. So under the psychiatric and mental health services operational policy, if an individual is admitted into medical care for a suicide attempt, they are to be kept under close supervision. And until they are deemed to be in a stable condition to not harm themselves, they will be kept under watch, so to speak. And this really does contrast with the legal approach, where we are still treating it from a very punitive aspect, where suicide attempts are seen as a crime. And I'll just like to point out as well that for those charged under Section 309, if a person is charged under that, there's no indication that he or she is to be referred to for further psychological care after or during the sentencing, which is quite different from what Singapore has in place. But I'll stop now and maybe give time to ANITA.
Thank you very much, Sulin. I will, Marsha, share from a perspective in the community. What we have done when either people are battling suicidal thoughts or they have attempted suicide. From our own experience, what we have done is when a situation like that occurs, we will bring the person to the emergency department where they will be assessed, and typically they will be warded for further assistance and attention, right? So it really depends on the situation, on the severity of the attempt as well. We have also, so that's very common in the many cases that we have experienced. We have also encountered incidences where when the attempt fails and the police comes in and they're brought to the police station, and then the night itself or the next day they are released. So that has been some of the experiences that we have encountered as well. So what happens is when we try to bring the person in for further intervention, either the family or the peer, the person, him or herself, isn't keen to get the treatment. So this is when it becomes very tricky and challenging. And so that is why I think the gap is still very present. And what we have noticed doing this work for 4 years now is we really need to have a very solid support system or network at where we're at, right? That means knowing where the health clinics are, the nearest hospital, the police, whatever that needs to be involved. And that way we wouldn't have to have that person be in prison, for example, right? Because even if you put the person in remand, there's no intervention because the person isn't well. The person isn't in a clear state of mind. They need assistance, they need help, they need treatment and support. So this is based on what we have encountered and experienced at MIASA so far. That's how we've been doing it, the process. Yeah.
Thank you, everybody. That is actually a very interesting thing that all of you have a different experience, a different perspective to how Malaysia deals with people who have attempted suicide. It seems like there is no one proper procedure or guideline in which we follow and that all will be taken care of. And if we were to follow one procedure, we may not be able to get the optimum treatment. So for instance, if it so happens that somebody gets fined or gets put in prison for this, he or she may not be able to get the right treatment or the right help. And even if they are captured by the police, sometimes the police may refer them to the hospital. Sometimes they may be released the day after. So there's really no clear steps as to what would happen if somebody happens to attempt suicide. So it seems like we as a community are not sure what to do with them. As you guys have mentioned, from a top, there's mixed perspectives whether it's from a health perspective or whether it's from a legal perspective. So it's very, very interesting actually that all of you have different experiences or different information about how we deal with that.
Yes.
So, yeah, Sulin, please.
No, I just wanted to add on to Puan Anita's point that it is actually really interesting if you look at the laws. So to kind of build on what Puan Anita said about bringing in the person to seek help. Now, we do have Section 309 of the Penal Code, which specifically and very clearly lays out that anyone who attempts suicide is to be charged, and to be punished in a sense. But if we compare this to another law that we have in place, which is the 2001 Mental Health Act, under Section 11, if a person is brought to the police officer and the police officer has reason to believe that he or she is mentally disordered, so take note of that term, then there is a recourse whereby the police officer is actually empowered to take that person to a medical officer. Within 24 hours, the apprehended person is to be brought to an MO, or a government psychiatric hospital where he will be subject to being assessed as to whether he is really mentally unsound of mind. And if the medical practitioner actually identifies that, yes, there is an element of mental health issues in the individual, then the person is not actually penalized. And that's the interesting thing.
Yes, because
they're not, in fact, they're referred to treatment at a medical psychiatric institution. So this shows us that even within the law, there are really very different pathways. And it seems as though there is a conflict now, depending on which law you apply or what you are sanctioned under. You may either get help and assistance, or you may receive that the burden of punishment.
Right, and Sulin, that is why it's very important for the police to know the law, because a lot of time the police don't really know much. So typically when a person attempts suicide, they would be treated as a criminal. That is the truth of what happens on the ground, really.
May I add, I think it's by way of partial question also. As far as I know, the Mental Health Act, says what you said, but it doesn't preclude or exclude the police still charging the person after that. So the Mental Health Act just says the obligation or what they can do, and it allows them to detain. That means they have the right to detain under the Mental Health Act. But I don't know, maybe the legal person, FIRDAUS, might be able to clarify this. I don't think it still excludes the person being charged later.
I tend to lean towards Justin's view, and why. I'll give the justification. If we go back to the wording of Section 309, I'll reread the relevant part, not the whole part. It says whoever attempts to commit suicide and does any act towards the commission of such offence, shall be punished with imprisonment. The wording used here, and the key word here is shall, and there are cases which says that where the word shall is used in a provision, it means it is mandatory for the court to implement the punishment. The court, the judges doesn't exactly have discretionary powers here to take into account the differing situation of an individual once that individual is charged under Section 309. And so I may not be able to confirm for sure, but it's looking like it's not entirely an out, like how Sulin mentioned earlier. If that person is charged under 309, then the court will have to impose a punishment where it is proven. But if that person is not charged under Section 309, then that question wouldn't come in the first place. I hope that helps.
I think that's right. And again, so that really does kind of emphasize that the act that you apply is very important, because under Section 11 of the Mental Health Act, so that's an act that I must confess I'm a bit more familiar with. Section 11(1) does state that the police officer may apprehend any person whom he has reason to believe is mentally disordered. And the section following that does state the police officer who has apprehended such a person shall, as soon as practicable, but not later than 24 hours after the apprehension, bring the person to a medical officer in a government psychiatric hospital or a registered medical practitioner in a gazetted psychiatric hospital. So I would argue that in as much as Section 309 mandates the police officer to, mandates the court to punish the person, if the Mental Health Act is applied, a different outcome will be reached. And this is why what Singapore did was really good. So just to go back in time a little bit, at the beginning of the year in January, Singapore had actually taken several steps to reform the process of how the law views suicide. And one of the first things it did was to decriminalize suicide attempts under Section 309 as well. But the second thing it did was to also amend its Mental Health Care and Treatment Act. So with that amendment, the police officer who is who apprehends a person suspected of attempted suicide is equally obligated to bring him to a medical officer. But you see, that element of punitive, the punitive element was removed first before the second reform came into place.
Right. Wow. Okay. This is actually very, very important to note about how the different acts and how the legal system actually interacts with one another, because I think it was really great that Justin and FIRDAUS could have that discussion, and that Sulin could help us compare it with the Singaporean way of doing this in terms of their legal system. Because it's true, if we still need the police to help us out, help them out with this, you know, they do need help to be brought into the hospital and all, but the punitive, the implications from a punishment should be removed. And so that is a very, very nice way to put it. I'm very happy to have such a wonderful discussion from all of you. Now we can move in a little bit further to why we decriminalize suicide in the first place. After understanding that everything is a bit mixed, everything is a bit messy, let's start from the beginning. Why is it that our legal system wants to treat suicide and suicide attempts as a crime? Maybe FIRDAUS, you can go first.
Okay, so actually, what I mentioned earlier about about how we have Section 309 in the first place, that had actually addressed your question as to why we treat that we treat it as a crime. I would say it was because we have Section 309 in the Penal Code that actually contributes towards suicide or attempted suicide or a cry for help for for those who are in that situation. Why that situation is stigmatized, because it is considered a crime under our law. And so in a society like Malaysia, deeply embedded with tradition, religion, and culture, all that compounded to the stigma that criminalization of suicide had already created. And so to me, the reason why we have that in the first place, I mentioned earlier, how it was imported. And it doesn't make sense, if you ask me, the fact that the country in which the provision originates from had already done away with it in 1961, and we are still where we were 60 years ago. Yeah.
Yes, totally agree. Actually, one of our attendees, Nur Marsha, she actually said something really important, where in Article 5 of our federal constitution, we have the right to life and liberty, but yet we still have this in the penal code. So you're right, it's interesting to see those kinds of interactions between the laws. From what I'm hearing, it seems like the law contributes to stigma, and the stigma retains the law. Would you say that happens when we talk about suicide?
Okay, well, when we talk about why do you have laws in the first place, we look at the reasoning, or rather what was the principle behind having that law in the first place. Is it a retribution? Is it a deterrence? There are a couple of other concepts as well. And when you look at the most of the writings, legal writings on this, the criminalization of suicide was widely seen as a deterrent step, so that you cannot, you can have, once you can, the state can control, that was, maintain peace and order. That was the whole idea behind it, and deter more people from dying by suicide, or from attempting suicide. That was the whole idea behind it. But if your next question here is whether or not deterrence really works in this case, then that's a whole discussion, because I think we've heard even from outside the panel, a lot of people have already highlighted that that deterrence doesn't really work in preventing suicide. In fact, it was because it's criminalized, it led to people taking more extreme measures in order to make sure that they die by suicide, and it does not end with an attempted suicide in which they have to then face Section 309. Yeah. Thank you.
Wow,
I think
okay.
if I may add, Marisha.
Sure, Sulin, definitely.
Anita.
Sorry, Miss Anita.
That's okay. Also, just to add, there is, I'm a Muslim. There is also a religious context to it, I believe, because the life that we have isn't ours, right? It belongs to God. So that religion context, I think, is one of the reasons as well for the criminalizing of suicidal attempts. So in Islam, ending one's life is a cardinal sin. But of course, this is not the issue what we're talking about, but just to give you a little bit of insights on the religion context of it.
So much, Anita. I think that's really important that you brought up the religion side, because it is very much embedded in our country. Yeah, and religion is not one of the only things I think that continues our legal system to act in such a way. There's a lot of history and a lot of culture in our country that also contributes to that. So maybe if you or Sulin can share about that, that would be really interesting to see as well.
May I add just one
Sure,
point about
please.
Anita's from?
Yes.
Yeah, so it is very true. So even other religions also consider a sin to actually take one's own life. But the problem arises like when you talk about decriminalization. So either authorities or even some people who are religious minded equate decriminalizing to saying that it is okay to take your own life, which is a wrong equivalence. Do you get what I mean? That means you say,
Yeah.
if I say decriminalize, that means it's not a criminal act. So then people worry, they say, but if you say that, that means doesn't mean it's okay to.
Yeah, we validate suicide.
Yeah, but that's not the thing. The reasoning is entirely out. Nobody is saying that we are, whoever's advocating decriminalizing is saying it's okay and it's not a sin. That's another realm, another morality. It's an issue of morality and ethics, etc. So it could be sinful, but shouldn't be criminal. So it's not equated unless, of course, if you went with maybe religious laws may apply in certain countries. So I think that's an important point to note. A lot of the issues of the reluctance to decriminalize is, does it mean that it's okay then to do it, to attempt and to try and kill yourself, or to kill yourself actually?
Yes. I think the last thing we should see suicide is as black or white, as sin or right or wrong. Yeah, I think, Sulin, do you have something to say?
Yeah, I think perhaps steering it away from the religious, or stepping aside from the religious element as well. I think there is also an assumption within the law that removing this element of penalization will actually result in an increase in suicides. So again, it's bringing that very black and white paradigm that, if you take away the punishment, then naturally more people will be encouraged. Or as one participant I think mentioned, the floodgates will just open and people will start taking their own lives. But actually, if you look at the evidence and the research that has been done, there is a lot of evidence to show that this is actually not the case. So I would like to point out a particular study that was done in 2016. This was carried out by professors based in Canada at the University of Quebec in Montreal. And what they did was they had obtained criminal codes from 192 countries, and comparing those countries where suicide attempts were decriminalized compared to those where it was still punished. And they found significantly that suicide rates did not actually differ widely between countries that do or do not punish. So this really tells us that punishing those who have attempted suicides does not actually help to bring down the suicide rates. And in fact, because of this, there is actually reason to explore the option of decriminalizing what is really something that should not be should not be seen as a crime or treated as a crime. One thing that the authors did mention as a caution was that they found that in the countries where suicide was decriminalized, there was a slight increase in the reporting in the short term. But I personally believe, and I think this is supported as well by a lot of literature, that slight increase in the short term is due to the fact that the fear of legal implications has been removed. Therefore, more people are, I wouldn't say comfortable, but it is a more accepted for family members to actually, admit or tell the police officer that someone has actually completed the suicide. And if you turn it if you try to go back to data and what the research tells us as well, there was a study done by someone by the name of Lester in 2002. So he conducted this study that found that there was an increase in the mean 5-year official suicide rates of 7 countries that had decriminalized, but he followed this up with another 20-year timeline, so more wider longitudinal time frame of evaluations in Canada and New Zealand. And there he found that in the long term, there's no significant increase in suicide rates after suicide is decriminalized. So the research does strongly point to or support the case for removing this punitive element, really.
Thank you, Sulin. Thank you, Justin. So based on what I'm understanding here, when we see suicide, when we see the statistics, when it comes to people who are seeking for treatment, it's not so much that decriminalizing increases it, it actually reduces the stigma so people can come forward to receive treatment. One of our attendees, Monisha, she actually said this, which I thought is very true. Decriminalizing suicide facilitates direct treatment of suicidal tendencies, not encourage them. And I think that's a really, really good point to make that I believe that you all share with. So it's very, very, very good to see that this is how we can map up and comprehend the complex issue of suicide here. But I want to focus a little bit about the stigma attached. Part of the reason why we criminalize it is, of course, with the assumptions and with our stigmas that we hold. I'm just wondering if there are any stigmas in place in Malaysia that maybe we can talk about for our audiences. Anybody's welcome to share.
Well, I can add on from what we already discussed. So we've mentioned religion, and it's not just Islam, but in other religions, specifically due to how these religions view suicide, view sanctity of life. So we've talked about that. But we've also there are also other how do I say this stigma. And this would cover, for example, how a person, if they actually have these thoughts, it would mean that person is, say if you're Muslim, you have a weak faith. And so therefore, if you pray 5 times a day, then this wouldn't have happened, for example. So you have that. And that's one. And then second, it could also be, one of the stigma would also include that, or that person just doesn't have, a self-discipline to, for example, to have healthy habits, to get out of bed. When it's not as easy as that, isn't it? It's not. How do I say this? Well, when you talk about mental health, it's not something that person can choose to do or not to do. But not many people appreciate this. So that it's self-inflicted. You did this to yourself. Just snap out of it. Those are the kind of stigma we've heard. And there's also this stigma. I'm not quite sure other cultures, but in the Malay culture, it's like jangan malukan nama keluarga. And so all the more reason they don't want to seek help, because then if other people know about it, then the whole family will then be viewed as, there is this so and so in this family, and then everyone will get curious, and then the whole family will be ashamed. So they don't want to bring shame to the family. So even those are some of the stigmas that we can see from within our society, from the tone of conversation in social media. It is really not supportive towards addressing this issue. I hope that helps.
Yeah. It's really funny. I think one of the FAQs, FIRDAUS, being in the Malay community and the Islamic religion, that when a suicide happens, the FAQ would be, is the person Muslim? Why did they choose to end their lives? Especially when amongst our family, if we watch it on television, or even when we watch a movie, if it's a Muslim, then it will be a shock, for example. So that's the most common FAQ. And then the further comments will come in. The person had everything. The person looked fine. She's rich. She's famous. The person comes from a good family, for example. With the implication of the question, there must be a life event that understandably that led to a situation where the person felt, life was not worth living. But that's a simplistic way of looking at, or perspective of suicide. So we need to realize that suicide, is a final fatal outcome of, a mental health disorder, for example. Substance abuse. There are a lot of things, either, like Justin said earlier, it could be diagnosed, it could be undiagnosed. But again, the person not seeing that way out. And I always say stigma truly is a true poison of it all. And because of how our culture is built in, that it becomes such a taboo that people that are battling suicidal thoughts and ideation, or not seeing a way out, can't reach out for the help. They're embarrassed to talk about it. There's so much fear, and we see this constantly with the peers that we deal in MIASA. Family members come in, bereaved people, and when we hear about the stories, it's so unfortunate. There's no closure. Marisha, I've been as far as Trieste, talking to the bereaved from NAMI, National Alliance of Mental Illness in the US. 200,000 members, caregivers, bereaved people. The story is always similar, where there's so much embarrassment. People feel so ashamed to talk about it. And I think that it limits ourselves and restrict ourselves from talking about, mental health. Because if we can normalize the discussion surrounding mental health disorders, surrounding people with, mental health condition, taking away the shame from it, taking away the shame from people going through struggles with addiction, for example, a lot can be done. Suicide can be prevented, so there's such a big role in the community. There's such a big role amongst, all stakeholders, really, so that people no longer are afraid and don't fear this, right? So it doesn't have to wait until a person wants to attempt suicide. Just struggling with a mental health condition, that help is available, and we're not afraid to seek for that help.
Thank you so much, Anita and FIRDAUS, for
may I add
sharing.
about
Yes,
the stigma?
please.
So, I mean, definitely I agree with everything you said, fantastic. But just from the communication point of view, the stigma arises a lot with the language and the terminology and words used, and those things create a certain view that people have of a certain incident, event, or whatever. So if you're talking about suicide, then earlier it was pointed out, it's very important that people change their language in talking about completed suicide or even successful suicide, a term that's still used in research in other circles in the mental health thing. What kind of notion does it give to that, first of all? Then from the legal point of view, to say committing is always associated with, first of all, a kind of a conscious act done intentionally, and then often also related to committing a crime, committing something wrong, So all these things have to get out of the language, The very first mention of anything of a mental health problem, the reaction is, saya bukan mental, I'm not crazy. So crazy, gets equated. So the language has to change quite a bit. So when you talk about stigma and decriminalization, there's other things also that people think that it is, first of all, for myself, that means the person who's feeling suicidal, yeah, will I be then treated and dealt with as a criminal? So therefore, I do not want to bring it up. But if the language changes, then people will know that it is not a crime. So then again, it relates to all what Sulin, Anita, and all I've mentioned. People find it easier to come out with what is going on with them. The whole idea of overcoming the stigma.
It's so interesting, Justin, you know, that suicide continues to take, our young generation, for example, and it's so interesting where the irony, and we arrive to a very strange situation that with such rocketing numbers, we still don't know enough about it, and we're not doing enough about it, and people continue to stigmatize and label and say so many things. So this is where we are at today. And I think one of the ways, of course, is decrim, but there are so many other gaps that can be filled up other than decriminalization of suicidal attempts, in all honesty. I can give you a very good example. For those of you that know, Trieste is, although there are loopholes, but in Trieste, it's a very successful model. So they have closed down institutions since 1970s, right? And so how they did it was closing it down, investing in community mental health services. So they expanded community mental health services, huge savings after that. Before, with mental institutions, they spent 47 million. Once it's closed, double to invest. And then today, they only spend about 16 million for 24/7 community mental health services. But what is so interesting about it is, for the past 20 years, the suicide ratio has declined by 50%, 50, Marisha and everyone. So this is an enormous success, and this is what needs to happen. Intervention in the community, prevention works, mental health promotion needs to happen. So this is what we're not seeing very much in Malaysia, although I can see and I feel we are progressing and we are in the right direction, but not fast enough, especially not on decrim.
Well, actually, what you,
yes,
if
sorry,
I can add, just very, very short, what we've seen, what other countries have done is that when they decriminalize suicide, what they did together with that is increase resources on addressing mental health, increase the numbers of psychiatry. So like what Anita said, so it's not like, decriminalizing is a standalone, recourse that we want to do here. It comes together with what Anita said. Thank you.
Yeah, because one of the solutions is really to redistribute the current resources that we have. So that is what needs to be done in order for, deinstitutionalization to happen or decrim to happen, to fill up that gap. Because what happens now, so once we decrim, then what's the next step? So we have to have a clear pathway, and we have to have enough services, human resources available to help the people in need, for sure. So one of the best ways I feel, and this was a recommendation by one of the studies done by Health Systems Research with Harvard University and MOH, where the huge recommendation was actually to leverage on primary healthcare network, of course, right? Because based on research, 49.4% of Malaysian see a GP as their first point of contact when they have a mental health issue. So that in itself tells you that if the GPs, of the family medicine specialists, all these people are trained, then a person that is going through just a mental health issue, right, could get the intervention early without even having to enter the mental health system in the first place. They wouldn't have to see a psychiatrist or psychologist. The GPs or the doctors at the health clinics or private clinics in the community would be able to tell them, look, these are some coping mechanisms that you could use, try to, change your lifestyle, right? Exercise more, eat a balanced diet, you've got to rest, take care of yourself. So this is what needs to happen in the community, really.
Yep, I agree totally, Puan Anita. And in fact, If you think back to 2019, the Pakatan Harapan government, I think it was one of their clear mandates that they were looking into amending the penal code to repeal this section 309. And what the then late Minister and Prime Minister's Department, 𝗦𝗢𝗘𝗏𝗧𝗘𝗗 had said that, alongside these, the action to decriminalize must also come into place redress mechanisms. So what are the plans? What are the gateways to help that we are going to put in place, even as much as we take away this element? And I think, if I may make an intelligent guess, part of the reason why we haven't decriminalized suicide yet is because there is a lack of a plan as to how we're going to tackle what happens next if someone were to commit or to attempt suicide. Are there proper pathways and proper systems to assist them, to bring those people to trained professionals to guide them to help? It doesn't seem that there is much of alignment between the government ministries at the moment, because as we know, this cannot be confined to just the health ministry. It involves the social welfare department, it involves the women's ministry. There has to be an all of government approach, and perhaps the priority of the government of the day may not be too closely on that issue.
Yeah. We actually don't have champions in there right now. What happened was we had a discussion, I think it was, Justin, were you there early this year, with the psychiatrist, MOH, AG Chambers? And I feel that, to be fair on their side as well, they don't really understand mental health. They don't really understand why people would attempt suicide in that context. So I think they're really trying to study it. They're really trying to understand it before they repeal the section 309. But we got to move faster, guys.
Agree.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
And I think it begins with education.
Yeah, definitely.
And the law itself. I mean, if you think of it from a statecraft perspective, the law is underpinned by culture, but the law can also be a basis of changing culture, changing norms. If it were to be decriminalized, it seems to me that it would sort of set that barometer of social acceptance. Well, not acceptance, but to have more empathy towards the issue. And that could then lead to perhaps more concerted efforts, as you say upon ANITA, to provide education to the first aid responders, be they the police officers, be they the medical officers. Yeah,
definitely. We need to be ready. If that happens on the ground, we have to be ready.
Wow, that was a very, very interesting progression that you guys made from understanding why we criminalize suicide, why decriminalizing is good, but we need to do more. We need to create a system, a mechanism, as Sulin said. And I think that starts with addressing as many different gaps that we are currently having, as ANITA mentioned as well. So just to wrap things up, I wanted to ask, from your respective fields, what are they doing to progress the decriminalization of suicide? Now, efforts to actually help people who are going through this.
Sorry, I don't understand the question.
From your respective fields, like Justin, you are in Befrienders, you are helping via hotlines. Is there anything that Befrienders is doing to help decriminalize suicide and to help others manage suicide better?
As an organization, because of the recognition we have for the work we do, we are represented in national consultative bodies and consulted for those kind of things. And actually, it's actually gone quite far ahead, as Sulin points out. It is already close to being tabled, to be repealed. And the gaps are not real to some extent, because whatever they say is missing is already available in some other act or another kind of process or policy. Maybe back to your basic question, what are we doing to decriminalize otherwise? Wherever we can and have a voice, we say that this is an essential and extremely important thing to do. And we do have a voice in some of these organizations, so we do that. You know? When it comes down to the individual people we speak to, we try and tell them about, a common anecdotal response from a caller, someone calls, is to say that, oh, I don't want to go to see a psychiatrist and say that I'm feeling like I want to kill myself, because then I would be charged, because attempting or thinking about, or some people would say, I've actually tried to kill myself and now I realize that I need to get the help, or somebody pushes them to go to them, but they don't, because they say, then if I do, then would I be arrested? Would I be charged? Yeah. So in our small, simple way, since we Befriender volunteers know it, so whenever we get the chance, we tell them that. That's on the individual level. And in any other kind of forum where we give public talks and awareness, that sort of thing, it's always to encourage people to, first of all, realize that it is not a crime, and they should not feel for themselves as a criminal. But as people have pointed out, there are many other forums and people who are having more influence in the public arena who need to change their thinking and help more than what we can do.
Right, understand.
Yeah.
Yes, Anita, do you want to say something?
Okay, so for us at MIASA, because we are a peer group, so a lot of work that we do, of course, like Justin said, very much involved in discussions about decrim. And as much as possible in any of our programs, awareness talks, any opportunity we get, we talk about this. That's one. Two, we have created a crisis team. So at MIASA, we now have a crisis team. And this is how we help the community, on the ground. So people can walk in, we can go to people's houses or wherever they're at when they're in crisis and help them out. And this really happens a lot. One of the advantages being MIASA, I think being a peer support group, is we have a safe space, right? So we do circle time, we have circle of care, different kinds of safe spaces where people that are battling, suicidal thoughts, ideation, or want to end their lives, or any kind of, mental health issue, addiction, whatever it might be, can come and, be honest and frank about it, right? Without having that fear. And when they do that, we then have the opportunity to educate and help them to get the help and treatment that they need. And because they, typically what happens is, because we are people with lived experience, we're able to relate, there's no judgment. And so the conversation then becomes very open, right? So it's easier for us to be able to do that, right? Because the trust is there. It's easy for everyone to relate. There's no judgment. There's no labeling. The conversation just ends when everyone leaves the safe space. So I think that is one of the advantages of MIASA with the work that we do. We're able to help, a lot of people on the ground that are struggling, and also caregivers that are, struggling with their spouses or children or other family members that are battling that in itself, which happens a lot. Because it's very unfortunate sometimes, because of the limited, number of, psychiatrists, the long waiting period, that becomes a barrier. So when you're on the ground, it's easier, you're right there, they can just walk in, they can come. So help becomes faster, right? And we have more time to sit with them and either do psychoeducation or support or provide that intervention that is needed. And as much as possible in MIASA, we provide non-medical alternatives. So that's also because we have to look at the person as, as a whole. Because there's a lot of underlying issues, what is the crux of the issue, right? And so that is why we're able to, for example, help a lot of B40s that have financial struggles. You know, we belong to a platform where there's a lot of help. A lot of agencies, you know, can help at no cost to provide, you know, skills, to provide seed capital for people that don't have money to start a business, for example, that need help with their loans and debts, for example, which is a huge problem now, being the pandemic of COVID-19. Don't have money to buy medicines or you know, medical supplies, equipment, whatever that they might need. So I think this is one of the things that with MIASA being in the community, we are able to help them to solve whatever, you know, underlying issue or problems that they have. Because again, if you provide that alternative and solution to a person that is struggling with suicidal ideation or thoughts, providing that help will, you know, help them not to go to that extreme end. Alhamdulillah.
I think thinking about the gaps that we have right now in why suicide, the push for decriminalization is not really happening. I think it relates a lot back to what actually allows people to see reason for wanting to decriminalize. And if you look at it from, if you look at it from, say, a pyramid point of view, where at the top level you have the policymakers, and on another level you have the business community, and at the grassroots the community. So each of these groups, if I may call them in that way, require different pieces of information in order for them to move forward. That's what I feel. So if you think about the policymakers, what is it that would encourage, or rather get them to start thinking? Is the data. What are the numbers that we have? And the sad reality is that there is really no reliable data on suicide as of yet in our country. The closest that we got was with the National Suicide Registry that was started in 2008, and there was another one in 2009. But the real limitations attached to these reports, and this is both not just from my personal perspective, it was in fact it was stated in the report that a major problem was missing data. You know, you had states who would go 1 year without reporting any cases at all. And this is a real hurdle, this is a real obstacle, because in order to move policy, you need evidence, like it or not. Policy change cannot happen without the numbers, without the figures, even more than, you know, the testimonies that come from the ground. What policymakers need are the numbers to then raise in the Day One Rakyat, which will then lead to further discussions, right? And then if you think about the second layer, the business community, I think what we really lack now are more studies that capture the net economic cost of suicides and suicidal attempts. So what I mean by that is what do we know about the direct medical costs of suicidal cases? What's the indirect cost, you know? Lost income for families, lost productivity for employees. Are we measuring these things? What are the potential savings from these projected costs if we could invest more in healthcare or intervention efforts in the community? What would that spell out for employers in terms of being able to save on that? And I think having that case study, more case studies like that coming up, would help to build this awareness, or this recognition at least, of wanting to do something. And then finally, when you bring it down to community level, I just think there's not enough, as to echo what my fellow panelists have said, there are not enough conversations or open dialogues being held about this issue, which many people tend to shy away from because they either think it's taboo, or they think that it might lead to people, it might precipitate people to think about taking their own lives. But if you think about it, you know, in the wake of Robin Williams' death, there was a documentary called Robin's Wish that was I think it was released this year, if I'm not mistaken. And the amount of you know, the ripple effect that it caused, because there was this celebrity figure that on the surface seemed so in control and so happy, so content. To know the struggles that he was facing underneath helps the layperson to realize that it is actually something that everyone goes through, these struggles, you know. And then And that awareness then creates this acceptance that it's not something that you should be ashamed to speak about if you're facing difficulties. I think that in our culture, the taboo is still very prevalent. And if I may call upon, people from the arts, people in the arts and culture industry, if we cannot penetrate from a very policy approach, then do it through other ways. Do it through mediums that people's popular culture. Don't romanticize it. That's not what I'm saying, but make it something that a touch point that people can start to say, did you see that film? Or did you watch that clip? What do you think about it? Was it, how did you feel? Could you relate to that? And that's where change starts to happen. That's where people start to become more broad-minded and open up to different views and different perspectives.
Sulin, I think that last point was really good because really media plays a very important role in combating the stigma, right? Because right now I think there's a lot of reinforcement of stigma with what we see in inaccuracy in portrayals of people with mental health disorders, for example, or how suicide is being reported. And I think that a lot of, it comes back to education, right? So we really need to train the media. We have to have the discussion with media. It's so interesting, again, that when we watch dramas and films and movies or music videos and songs, when it comes to issues as taboo, as difficult and challenging as mental health and suicide, that we never want to portray people that are battling these issues being successful people, or despite whatever challenges that they go through, they can get married and be happy and be productive, or can even recover really, right? So media really, guys, needs to play an important role, and they can really change that or shift that perception of the general public and normalize that discussion, like Sudin was saying, because it will open up that conversation about it. Because look at the movie Joker, a lot of people watched it, a lot of conversation. I mean, there's a good part of it, there's not a very good part of it. So hopefully when we watch movies like that, it spurs a lot of discussion, and we can correct whatever is not correct or not an accurate portrayal, right? So for me, and based on through research, media really plays a very, very crucial role in combating stigma. And this really needs to happen. So more education. Hopefully we can work together with movie producers, songwriters, whatever we can, at least in the community.
Yeah. And I would add as well, your organization focuses a lot on the lived experience.
Yep.
People who who have gone through something. And I believe there's a lot of power in being able to tell your story in a way that doesn't make it general, because everyone's experience is unique. But
Definitely.
to have someone, to have individuals courageous enough to use their voice to really tell what it's like.
Yep.
And I'm reminded of a documentary, actually. It was called Suicide, the Ripple Effect.
Yeah. Kevin Hines.
Yes, that's right. And so when you're familiar with it, but when he was 19, he tried to take his life by jumping off the Golden Gates Bridge. But after that attempt, he decided that he would make this film about his journey to better understand why he did it, and the effects that it had on his family, on his friends, on the people who responded to him to save his life. And I personally believe that, if that sort of documentaries, more of those could be available, then something could change.
Definitely. I agree. We've gotten a lot of feedbacks, Sulin and everyone, from people that have watched our videos or seen the sharing of our peers, where they feel very inspired and there's a lot of hope that they too can recover. So sharing successful stories or people with lived experience provides a lot of insights, which, then translates to a lot of understanding and better support and treatment. So that in itself can reduce a lot of stigma among society. I think that's very important. Thank you, Sulin, for bringing that out.
And
Thank you, everybody.
The data
Yes.
must come in as well.
Yeah,
And data and narrative, right, Sulin?
yeah,
That's
narrative,
right. Yes.
definitely. Yep.
Firdaus, is there anything else that you would like to say about what your field is doing?
I know we have to move on to Q&A, but I'll just summarize my points very quickly. I do have a couple of things, and also to agree on to what the previous speakers have said, and I'll say it here, right here, that data collection and documentation is really not in our government culture, and that has to change. Because if you want to talk about law and policy reform, you need to look at data, and if we don't have that data collection as part of our culture, then how can we have better laws and how can we have better policies? So that's one. And then second, as we have seen the past 1 hour and a half, this whole discussion centers around law, culture, and society. And it is not a one-way thing where law affects culture, culture affects society. It's one affects the other. And so the point about education, I agree. Yeah, we should also look at international standards and principles. For example, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights says that the government must recognize that everyone is entitled to enjoy the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. Both are given equal emphasis there in the international standards. But do we see that in our budgeting, for example, in the allocation for mental health and physical health? That is a question that we must discuss. Yeah, and at MCCHR, we law and policy reform are something that we are also working on, and this is something that we definitely would want to take further. And I don't know if there's any MPs watching this, but if they are, please take up this issue, because the comeback cannot be, oh, last year it was mentioned, and so that's a progress. That's not a progress. It's something that should have been done, when the UK had it removed 1961. And why do we still have it? So we urgently need to expedite this. And one thing that I can share that what MCCHR is doing currently is actually in 2 days' time, we are organizing a closed door dialogue exactly on this issue. And I'm sure ours is not, ours and also what the Reframe Project is doing are not the only conversation on mental health we're having right now. And that's a good thing, because the more people who talk about this, the more, how do I say this, the less stigmatized the issue become. And that can, like what Justin said, that can change the language around it, create more conversation, create the political momentum and will for them to actually expedite this issue in Parliament. Thank you.
Thank you, Firdaus. So from what we're hearing, it does start from the grassroots. It starts with building that political will that Firdaus mentioned. It starts with showing the data, the arts, the media, the role models that we need to push for change on both a political, policy, health, and just in general, our social welfare and the way that we perceive suicide in Malaysia. So I'd like to thank all our lovely panelists for taking the time and having those in-depth conversations. We really, really value them. And just like yourselves, the attendees have been having a lot of in-depth conversations too, both in the chat and in the Q&A. So I would love to share some questions with you all. And let's see what kind of discussions we can take with their questions. Okay, so we've got different kinds of questions. One is on law enforcement and the police. This attendee asks, how are the police informed of attempted suicide cases? Does the onus lie on medical practitioners to inform them? If yes, what is the view of medical practitioners on suicide being a crime? And how does this conflict with their duty and understanding towards the victim? So it has a lot to do with how the police view those procedures and how they perceive the victims as well? How do they handle that process?
I don't personally know whether it is in the law, as in the act. I don't think so. But my guess is that it would be in the internal regulation, internal circular. In the hospital, for example, if someone, from what I know, if someone is an undocumented migrant, if they go to the hospital, those who receive that information is mandated to report that person. My guess is there's something similar along that line, but if any of the panelists can confirm, that'd be good.
As far as I know from several psychiatrists I've spoken to, they usually, and the MOs who evaluate somebody coming in for attempted suicide, usually just treat the symptom or what's going on with the person. And if it's a mental health issue, then they treat that. They often lean towards not labeling it as suicide attempt out of compassion or just the pure objectivity that they take. They're saying, I don't know that the person actually was trying to kill themselves. Could have been an accident, could have been whatever. So I won't make that judgment. And I think this is partly behind, what's behind is also the criminal element of that act, So why would the doctor want to just put somebody into that kind of trouble? So out of compassion, sometimes we lose the data that we actually need to. So as far as I know, they are not compelled to indicate that someone is actually suicidal, and they just deal with the act at that particular time. When the police come in is usually when there's a case where somebody is doing a certain act and people actually report it and ask for the police help to stop them from whatever they are doing, or when sometimes what they're doing might be endangering somebody else. So that's when police are called in, and then they come and then they can call in bomba and all to do whatever physical rescue. And then after that, often enough, it leads to detaining or taking the person to the hospital. So that also has become really a discretion of the police officer and the commander, whatever you call it. And that also the police have said before. They won't right away arrest and take the person to lockup. So if they had, and they could, they might take them to the hospital directly, emergency unit. So again, depending on which kind of thing, and I don't want to go into methods that would lead to that line, but I think you kind of understand. I'll let the others say.
I agree with Justin, actually, on the point that a lot of, there is no compulsion on the part of the police officer to actually, to certify whether this person is an suicide attempter or not. What I do know from looking at the policy documents is that as FIRDAUS has mentioned, there is a standard operating procedure for forensic, forensic medicine services that is used in public hospitals. And within that document, it is stated that if the police brings in a body that is suspected of a suicide, there would need to be a filling up of a form. So there's something called a borang pemerintahan, where they then perform the post-mortem. So it seems that from that angle, a lot is dependent on what the police officer deems to be the right course of action. And as for the point that, Justin, I think you mentioned something about there being a sort of evasion on the part of wanting to report that it is a suicide. An interesting thing that was mentioned in the suicide registry was that the data that it is based upon is only on medically certified deaths. So that means deaths that have been, that an examination has been conducted and confirmed. A majority of cases may have been missed out because the cause of death was undetermined. So it was labeled as undetermined. So this again speaks to, I suppose, the gaps in data that we have. And there is no easy way to think about how we can start to address this, but I think it's important that we do.
Sorry, I just may add, I want to highlight maybe for the viewers or listeners, Sulin has been talking about deaths by suicide. Earlier, I was referring to attempts, and when people are brought in for medical treatment or to the emergency department.
All right, thank you, Sulin, and thank you, Justin, for your opinions and your knowledge when it comes to those who have attempted suicide and those who have died by suicide and how the police has dealt with that. We have another question, but it's on religion. So the question is, how do we inform the religious organizations or communities to support people with this problem and not condemn them? Have the ministry or NGOs engage with the religious communities and leverage on them to support people who have attempted suicide? I think Anita and FIRDAUS would be able to give us their thoughts.
You want to go first, Anita?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so with the Ministry of Health, they have engaged with religious bodies. So I know that discussion is in place. For us on the ground, for those of you that don't know, so for MIASA, our approach is a holistic approach. So spirituality is one of the big things, and we talk a lot about it from an Islamic perspective, about decrim. So again, when we come to religion, you know, ending your life, taking your own life is a sin, etc., etc. So how we have approached that is, yes, it is a cardinal sin in Islam, but using religion as guidance, as hope, providing a way out. So this is how we have approached or used religion to help those that are struggling with suicidal thoughts and ideation or attempts. And we continue to do that because I feel how well, at least for me, my generation, how knowledge has been, you know, ingrained when it comes to religion is more on hukum or sin and judgment, right? So there's always fear that is instilled. If you do this and this, you go to hellfire, for example. So not coming from the other aspect of religion, which really is guidance, is hope, is mercy, is forgiveness. And we don't talk a lot about that with children or teens. I mean, at least for me growing up. So I think this is the other aspect or shift that a lot of religious leaders, you know, teachers, religious teachers need to come from. I think this is very important because if not, a lot of the teens that come to MIASA, this will always be their fear when they want to open it up and talk about their struggles with suicidal thoughts and ideation. This is what we have experienced, and this is the challenge that we continue to see. So being parents, we have to come from that angle as well. We must be that safe space for our children. And we know that this is very prevalent in that age group. So something needs to be done. And religion, you know, spirituality, it's a big protective factor in itself. So we have to talk a lot more about this. Thank you.
One of the things that that we do at MCCHR is that we conduct engagements and dialogues. Yeah, and yes, we recognize and very much see the need, or rather, to bring together faith-based organizations and for them to be able to see that they too play a role in addressing issues such as suicide or mental health. And so what we have done, one of the initiatives would be to conduct a dialogue, and that dialogue is a closed door discussion. And that way we can then, you know, hopefully encourage more discussion and more of the stigmas that we discussed earlier to come out and actually be dissected as to why was there such stigmas in the first place, and was it a matter of religion, or was it a matter of culture embedded and seen as religion? Because that, you know, if that is the case, then that's something we can start to dissect and address. And so the stigmas, or rather religious perspectives which are unhelpful, on issues concerning suicide. That is one thing that needs to be discussed. Next, what should follow is what Anita said earlier, how can religion play a positive role? That has to be discussed. And that way, the faith-based organizations see that this is not a law matter where only the MPs, this is not a medical science matter where only psychiatrists and the psychologists have to do. This is a society matter where they too must play a part in reaching out to the society and addresses those stigmas and change them. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Anita and FIRDAUS. Seems like when we're talking about religion, it's about shifting our perception. Religion does not have to be against managing or helping people who have attempted suicide. We can actually work together, but we have to find out where we started from. Why did we diverge from one another when we can come together and help? So thank you so much for that. Now, a lot of people...
Sorry.
Sulin, please.
No, I just wanted to add on that it's true if you think about the trajectory of research that has been done on suicide and the epidemiology of suicide, at least in the context of Malaysia, a lot of it is approached from the medical and the public health perspective. So we have, studies that have been carried out since the 1960s even, that are looking at suicidal behaviors. But a lot of these studies tend to be repetitive, for lack of a better word. So they usually would look at reporting on the social demographic profile of suicides or suicide attempts. What are the risk factors? What are the methods? But I think there is a strong case for bringing in other fields of research and academia into the picture. What are anthropologists? How could they play a role? How could sociologists play a role? And I believe that if this was encouraged more in those fields, then we would begin perhaps to see more studies that are looking into or analyzing what the social cultural underpinnings are. What are the religious factors that could influence beliefs and perceptions about suicide? And I think having that added element would really help to strengthen the push to see it not as something that is criminal, for lack of a better word.
Yes, no, I totally agree with you, Sulin, because talking about this topic means trying to be as holistic as possible, right?
Yep.
That's why we want to involve academia, religious communities. We all have a role to play a part. So it's good that we can involve people who know how to measure and understand culture on a theoretical level as well. So thank you so much for that. Like I was saying earlier, a lot of our attendees have asked questions about how they can help somebody, a friend who is going through, who is having suicidal thoughts or suicidal ideation. One person asked, how do we intervene when we have someone we know who has a mental health issue and/or suicide? What are the few common misconceptions / mistakes people make when trying to help a person with suicidal thoughts? For example, what not to do when confronting a person with suicidal thoughts. I think Justin and Anita would be well versed in this question for sure. So please go ahead.
Anita, up to you.
Just because I'm a lady. Is that stigma?
I'm old school.
You're old school. Thank you very much, Justin.
Perhaps.
Okay, so how we have approached it, be it a person coming in with suicidal, thoughts or ideation or any kind of struggles in crisis. How we do it is we will encourage the person to tell us more, right? Tell us more about it. And there's so many things that needs to happen in the first minute when you talk to the person, right? So for example, giving the person your fullest attention, leaning in. If the person is sitting down, you've got to sit down, giving your full concentration, listening with empathy and compassion, not judging, listening for emotions. So there are a lot of things that needs to happen during that instant that if it doesn't happen, it could limit or it could restrict that person from opening up. And it could also shift that person's intention coming in to tell you and then not wanting to disclose anything, right? So we've had a lot of experiences. For example, a person calls in and suddenly says, you know, they're giving up, right? And so the moment that happens, we will immediately ask the person to come to where we are, or stay put and we will come to where the person is. So it's very important during that time to act fast, be calm, and don't panic. Because sometimes when people call in, I mean, Justin can agree, where they'll say, you know, I'm somewhere and I'm ending my life. So what can you do at that very instant? Firstly, is not to panic, right? Try to calm yourself and try to calm the other person at the same time. Because when you panic, you know, your thought process, what you're gonna say will be affected, right? So that comes with a lot of training and a lot of experience at the same time. So I can say in short, don't judge, listen, and listen to understand. Don't advise, because when you advise, that would be that barrier right there, and that discussion will end there. And you know, a lot of times what we don't realize as well, just to give you a little bit more of insight, is a lot of peers can also manipulate their diagnosis, especially when they meet a psychiatrist and they're not able to get that, to build that rapport or the trust involved. So they might not disclose everything even after many sessions, right? Because they know, if I were to say I hear voices or I see things that are not there, I could be diagnosed as, for example, schizophrenia, right? Or having psychosis. So that would then harm, because it comes back to stigma, that will harm my opportunity to get a certain job, for example. So you would then not disclose certain things so that your diagnosis will be anxiety or depression, and get the treatment for that, and not, you know, be limited or stigmatized further with, you know, more chronic conditions. So there's a lot of things that needs to be weighed, but at the end of the day, listen, be present, and give your fullest attention.
Thanks, Anita. So maybe I'll just add on, absolutely all that you say is fantastic. One of the things that often enough we find in the conversation is the difficulty people have with bringing up the question about suicide, both for the one who is going through it and feeling suicidal, and for anyone who's listening to them. So one of the misconceptions, the big one, is that if we talk about or ask about suicide, we may be putting the idea in someone else's head about actually wanting to kill themselves. So this is an absolute myth or misunderstanding. There's no way you can put the thought of somebody, you know, unless of course you do something like Guantanamo Bay mind, you know, brainwashing. But otherwise, when you ask them, what happens is they feel they are taken seriously. Because the other thing we hear is anyone who says something like, you know, I feel like I'm dying, I want to die. The common thing that friends, family will say to them, don't be silly. Stop thinking that way. That's ridiculous. Stop being a drama queen, even worse, you know, or king, yeah, drama king. So first thing is to actually ask if they're actually feeling suicidal. And sometimes you don't need to be asking straight out like that. So the simpler ways would be to, you know, ease in by saying, you know, do you feel like you cannot take it anymore? That you can't bear living anymore. So you can ease into that. And of course, the scary thing for many people who are not trained is, what do you say next if they say they are feeling suicidal, right? Yeah. So at the very basic level, I think Anita has mentioned it. You know? So what is it that's making you feel this way? Then it just goes back to the issues that they are facing. And we say, usually focus on what is the feelings that people are having about it, rather than thinking about the practical solutions. I mean, that can be there too, but don't forget to also deal with what is it that they are feeling about it. So someone now loses a job and he says, I feel like killing myself because I don't have any hope. Okay, so then you ask, okay, so what's making you feel like you want to end your life? And he says, yeah, I've lost my job. So losing a job, what does that mean, you know, for you? And then you get them to talk about that. And so it goes something like that. And then soon after, then it's for you to refer them to a professional, a mental health professional, or to organizations like ANITA's or the Befrienders to talk in the first level. And then we can take them further and also actually refer them to professional help if need be. Or you yourself, if you know, you can refer them to professional help. If they are looking like they're going to do it anytime soon, this current moment or in a few minutes or in a few hours, then even suggest that you would accompany them or take them to a hospital, emergency ward, what we call emergency department. So that's really important. It's a bit scary for a lot, but then you got to think about it. This is how I can save somebody from doing that little moment of just doing that impulsive act and then actually carrying out the attempt and even possibly dying from it.
Thank you so much, Anita. Thank you so much, Justin. So from what I can hear, it's all about being empathetic, you know, actively listening to what they have to say. And as Justin mentioned, it isn't really about solving the problem because they are feeling a lot. They are feeling like there's no way out. So we need to be able to address those feelings, try to connect it to what are some of the issues that they are having. And of course, I think the only advice that we can give them is to direct them to a mental health professional, because we do not know the extent, you know, how deep does this go? How do we, you know, take care of this issue? That is not our expertise. So I think it's a really good general overview, not just with suicide, but just those with mental health issues in general. How do we get them to understand and recognize that they may be going through something that they need professional help? So thank you so much for sharing. And with that, this concludes our Q&A session. To all our attendees, please do not fear. All the questions that you guys have posed, both on Facebook and on Zoom, we will collect it and we will get our esteemed panelists to answer them offline. But we have to close. We don't want to take up too much of your Saturday night. So before we end, I'm going to pass the stage over to the founder of the Reframe Project, Shazvini Naidu, to say a couple of words for you guys. Thank you so much. Thank you, esteemed panelists. You guys have been great.
Thank you, Marisha. Good job. Thank you.
Yes, great job, Marisha.
Great job, Marisha.
Thank you very much, Marisha.
Thank you.
Great job, Marisha. Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Shazvini, the founder of the Reframe Project, as well as the organizing chair for today's event. The Reframe Project consists of a group of passionate youth with the aim to promote mental health. I hope you have learned something from today's session. If you have, do comment yes on the chat box. Also, let us know what you think about this event by filling up the feedback form. Fret not if your questions was not answered, as we will be compiling all the questions, as Marisha said, from both Zoom and Facebook Live. Our panelists will answer the questions in their free time, and we will email the questions to you. Additionally, we are always on the look for people to collaborate with us and join us in promoting mental health. We have put up the list of roles on the last page of the feedback form. Should you be interested, do scan the QR code or go to the link for the collaboration form on the screen, which will be available soon. If you have any questions, feel free to
share my screen. All right. Can everybody see the screen? So you can scan either the feedback form or the collaboration form. We'd love to have you on the Reframe Project. We're trying to do as much work to help Befrienders, Souls, and MIASA in whatever way we can. And we're very happy that MCCHR has joined us. Sorry, Shazvini, is there anything you'd like to add?
Thank you, Marisha. If you have any questions at all, feel free to message us via Facebook or email us. We'll be more than happy to respond. Thank you, everyone. Have a great night.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you for the participants, for your interest. All the best.
All the best.
Thank
Take
you.
care. Stay safe.
Thank you, everyone.
Shazvini, Marisha, Anita,
Shazvini,
FIRDAUS,
Justin.
all the best. Yeah.
FIRDAUS, thank you.
Sulin.
Sulin, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone. Stay safe, please.
Take care, everybody.
Take
Take care,
care.
everyone.
Bye. Assalamualaikum. Bye.